Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Kambiz Ranawardi, a board member for ColumbiaDC and a graduate of the School of Engineering and Applied Science. First, I would like to thank our partners for this evening, Harvard Club of Washington, D.C., and the members for joining us. September 11, 50 years ago, there was a bloody coup in Chile, and we have taken this opportunity to invite the eminent expert, Maria Victoria Murillo, a professor of political science and international public affairs, and also director of Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia, to not only review, talk about the events of 50 years ago, but also to wholesale review U.S.'s Cold War foreign policy in Latin America, especially, and its legacy, especially considering the upheavals that are happening there on a daily basis today. So we are very excited about this conversation. Please allow me to briefly introduce our speaker, but I do encourage everyone to check our website for her full bio. Victoria has authored several books, among them Labor Unions, Partisan Coalitions, and Market Reform in Latin America, also Political Competition, Partisanship, and Policymaking in the Reform of Latin American Public Utilities. More recently, she has been working on electoral behavior, contentious dynamics, and the weakness of democratic institutions. She received her BA from Universidad del Buenos Aires and her MA and PhD from Harvard. She taught at Yale University, also was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard's Academy for Area Studies and David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. She's also a Fulbright Fellow. So without further ado, Victoria, sending it to you.
Hi, thanks a lot for the invitation. Please allow me to share a presentation with you. We are about to get into the 50-year anniversary of the September 11, 1973 military coup in Chile, which was a pretty dramatic event. The military of this country bombed the presidential palace, destroyed a lot of it, killed in the process, or he killed himself, we don't know, President Salvador Allende, who had been elected democratically. The current president of Chile, President Boric, has signed, along with all the former living presidents that have been democratically elected, a commitment for democracy. Chile lived right before the pandemic a huge upheaval, and there's tons of political discontent across the region, not just in Chile. But I think what struck me of this commitment is that they promise to fight the problems of democracy with more democracy. And I think this commitment to democracy that we saw during the transitions in the region was crucial. And it's also interesting how it represented a shift in the U.S. policy towards the region, which has not necessarily supported democracy during the Cold War era. So let me talk a little bit about the policy of the U.S. towards the region, and I hope this is clear here. So before the Cuban Revolution, the U.S. was already a very important actor for the region. The U.S. established the Monroe Doctrine even before being an hegemon, with the idea of excluding the Europeans from the region. But the way it was perceived by the countries of Latin America, especially after the Mexican-American War and the Spanish-American War and interventions early into the 20th century in Nicaragua, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, the creation of the Panama Canal, was the right of the U.S. to establish its hegemony in the region, but not of Europeans. So it's interesting that from very early on, the countries in the region sustain a doctrine of non-intervention. And the doctrine of non-intervention, it's of course a reaction to the frequent interventions of the United States, although the inequality, the asymmetry in power did not allow them to face those interventions, but at least the legally, that's how they thought about the United States. Then we had the start of the Cold War. And I think that make the tenure of the interventions of the U.S. in the region, which before had followed oftentimes economic interest or divisions within the region, to have a much more clear and ideological definition. Of course, we can start with the Guatemala coup of '94, which is, again, a crucial one, given the election of Arévalo's son, who was deposed by that coup recently in Guatemala, and the expectation that he will be inaugurated as president in 2023. I mean, in January of 2024. Of course, Cuba, there was a failed invasion in 1961. The Dominican Republic was invaded. The coups of Brazil and Chile were particularly telling in that they moved beyond what used to be called the backyard of the United States. So they didn't happen in the Central American Caribbean region, as most of the other interventions that happened before. These were two democracies in middle-income countries. Chile was one of the countries in the region, if not the one, with the longest democratic tradition. And so U.S. support for these coups had a particularly strong influence in the region, and also was the beginning of a process of military intervention that was much deeper than anything that had occurred before, in terms of not just repression, but changes in government strategies and state capacities. This period, I have to say, ends of course, with the end of the Cold War. The very last year, we had the invasion of Panama, and we have like more of the traditional backyard policies in Grenada, and of course, Nicaragua and Central America. And I think so there's two different reactions. So to the Brazil and Chile, the South American coups, than to the Central American coups. And I want to come back to this at the end. I think the type of democratic backsliding that we're seeing in Central America is very related in many ways to these interventions by the United States. The big issue that made the U.S. paid attention to Latin America was, of course, the Cuban Revolution. Nobody expected it to be so fast. The U.S. reaction to the Castro's policies brought the sanctions and the blockage. I have to say here that it would be a good time to evaluate, given the reliance on sanctions, these policies by the U.S. I think this has been a failing strategy. We still have the same regime, more than half a century later. Still Raúl Castro is around, Fidel died, but this has not worked. And the repetition of similar strategies like we're seeing in Venezuela with I'm afraid would also not be so successful in bringing democracy back. But going back to the 1960s, the Cuban Revolution had a real two consequences that would be very bad for democracy. One is that it generates an example across the region for guerrilla warfare, and Cuba also financed and helped guerrilla warfare across many countries in the region. Chile was not one of them. And that would be crucial to understand the military coups that happened in the 60s and 70s. Although, as I said before, neither Chile nor Brazil had guerrilla before their coups. So those were cases of constitutional governments that were deposed with no risk of military action. The second big change is the change in US policy. So the US had like two reactions. First, under President Kennedy, the push for the Alliance for Progress. The idea was to basically do not allow the conditions that permitted the Cuban Revolution to emerge, to provide reforms that enlarge the middle class, that make people more moderate and prevent the arrival of communism. Chile was a showcase in this policy. It was the largest recipient of US aid in the region, including much of the funding of the Christian Democratic Party that would, to which President Frey belonged. So that was a crucial strategy, and one, in a sense, that failed from the US perspective, especially from the Nixon perspective or Nixon administration perspective, because Allende was elected president nonetheless. And so the solution to that would be a series of actions trying to generate the conditions for a military coup. I think the military coup might have happened without the US, but certainly it's hard to tell because the US had so much effort at generating those conditions. So how do we go to that, to 1970 and the election of Allende before the coup? I think a timeline of the concern is important. In the 1958 election, Chile was already divided in thirds between the right, the center, which were the Christian Democrats, and the left. Led by the Socialist Party, and Allende was close to win the 1958 election. And so in 64, fearful of a victory by the left, the right-wing parties didn't field a candidate, and they supported the centrist candidate of the Christian Democrats, Eduardo Frei, and that was also whom the US support. It was the time of the most US funding and multilateral funding for Chile, so that Chile could do what Frei called revolution in liberty, right? So instead of nationalizing copper, this process of Chileanization of copper that included insurance for US firms, the slow process of land reforms with cooperatives, increasing popular participation, but including unions by the Christian Democrats, including for peasants, and the expansion of the vote. This is the time of the end to literacy restrictions. So the election of 1970 is the first one where the vote is truly universal in Chile. Now, what happened in 1970 is that there's, again, three candidates, and so there's the three blocks, the left, the center, and the right, and Salvador Allende, the socialist candidate, wins with a plurality of the votes. Because he doesn't have a majority, he needs congressional confirmation. Chile has a very strong tradition of separation of power, independent controlling institutions, electoral competition, including the Communist Party, which was founded domestically without connections to the Soviet Union originally. And so this was, in fact, Allende has been for many years in Congress. He was a socialist. He had been a legislator for many years. If you can see in the picture, he was certainly not the way Castro and the revolutionaries looked. And as I mentioned before, both in the case of Brazil and in the case of Chile, there was no guerrilla movement. And that was a huge contrast if you compare with Argentina, with Uruguay, with Peru, where it was defeated before the coup, with many countries, Venezuela, in the region, even democratic countries at the time like Venezuela, that experienced this emergence of guerrilla movements. But in Chile, because the left was so institutionalist and relatively strong, there was no space for such a movement. So the election of Allende, and there's been tons of, there has been a process of declassification recently, and more documents have emerged. But I think what I have here that has been on the news is this idea that once Allende gets elected, Richard Nixon, seemingly under the advice of Henry Kissinger, issue instructions to prevent the newly elected president of Chile, Salvador Allende, from being inaugurated. And the question is to create the conditions to overthrow him if he did assume the presidency. This is the famous notes by Helms about make the economy scream. What does it mean in terms, and there's like a whole book called the Pinochet Files that looks at this process. But the efforts of halting the inauguration of Allende really bring not just an economic effort, the demand to American companies that sees investment, the demand to multilateral banks that sees loans to Chile, the cut of U.S. aid, and Chile was the biggest receptor of U.S. aid, so this was pretty dramatic. The funding of the main newspaper, El Mercurio, the funding of parties that now turn the opposition, but also something that is a real odd strategy, which is the fake kidnapping of General René Schneider. General Schneider was the commander-in-chief of the army, and he was a supporter of the constitution, so he would not support the coup. So the idea was to kidnap him, blame the left, and that would cause the coup. The kidnap failed and ended up in the assassination of General Schneider, and that, in fact, congregates support for constitutional democracy and facilitates, in a sense, the confirmation of Salvador Allende with the support of the Christian Democrats. So he really gets confirmed, and the process continues, though, with high levels of legislative polarization. So it's harder and harder for Allende to govern. There is a process of media polarization here. The Mercurio, the main newspaper, is a crucial actor. But there's also a real polarization in society. There is a real polarization in the streets. The left start taking over factories, farms, and Allende loses controls of the more extreme sectors of the left. The right also becomes, there is a more fascist right that start taking the streets, that start using more violence. In the polarization, you start seeing a process of strikes, most famously the truck strike and the miners' strike. So this is, as I said, even without the United States, this was a process of pretty dramatic polarization, but certainly one where the U.S. put oil to the fire, right? There is a midterm election in 1973. The opposition is looking to a definitive victory that would allow the impeachment of the president. The opposition unites the right-wing parties and the Christian Democrats, but they don't achieve the victory they expect. They get 57% of the vote, but Allende is able to increase the support from what he obtained in the 1970 election. So in a sense, the institutional options, like they had tried to reduce his power, they had tried to impeach his cabinet members, or not impeach, but call them to question. All of that has not worked. So the only solution for the opposition in this polarized process is to support a military coup. The U.S. is informed of the coup a couple of days before, and the military coup is led by General Pinochet, who was perceived as a constitutionalist. In fact, the replacement of General Schneider, General Carlos Prats, was a constitutionalist. And because the situation was so polarized, and the military were so unhappy with him, who had who had become the Ministry of Defense. He resigns, and Allende appoints Pinochet under his advice, because Pinochet is perceived as being a constitutionalist military. But Pinochet at the very end, at the very last moment, joins the coup. And so the coup is successful. It's a pretty violent coup, not just because of the bombing, but because of the degree of repression and the thousands of people that were affected by it. And just, I think, I have, let's see if this works. I want to give you a sense of the message that the military junta provide. Let me see if I can.
A las 9 de la noche, los jefes de la sublevación se presentan públicamente al país.
Las Fuerzas Armadas y de Orden han actuado en el día de hoy solo bajo la inspiración patriótica de sacar al país del caos que en forma aguda lo estaba precipitando el gobierno marxista de Salvador Allende. La Junta mantendrá el poder judicial y la asesoría de la Contraloría. Las cámaras quedarán en receso hasta nueva orden. Eso es todo.
Tal vez sea triste que se haya quebrado una tradición democrática que en este continente era larga. Pero cuando el Estado pierde sus calidades, vienen aquellos que por mandato mantener su vigencia, asumir ese cargo. Hoy lo hacemos. Estamos seguros que Chile entero tiene que comprender el sacrificio que nos significa.
No se trata de aplastar tendencias o corrientes ideológicas, ni de ejercer venganzas personales, sino, como dije, de restablecer el orden público y volver al país por la senda del cumplimiento de la Constitución y las leyes de la República. Después de 3 años de soportar el cáncer marxista que nos llevó a un descalabro económico, moral y social que no se podía seguir tolerando por los sagrados intereses de la patria, nos hemos visto obligados a asumir la triste y que hemos acometido. No tenemos miedo, sabemos la responsabilidad enorme que cargará sobre nuestros hombros, pero tenemos la certeza, la seguridad de que la enorme mayoría del pueblo chileno está con nosotros, está dispuesta a luchar contra el marxismo, está dispuesta a extirparlo hasta las últimas consecuencias.
So I think one of the crucial things that I want to emphasize is that the parties were dissolved and banned, not just the left-wing parties that were severely repressed, but even the right-wing parties. The idea was not to have a Congress working, not to have democracy at all. It was a pretty dramatic take on the country and on the ability of politicians to have a role for a country that had such a long tradition of democracy in the region. The first cabinet was a more moderate one, including civilians, but that was very short. And then Pinochet started gaining power within the junta. Not only the repression became even worse, but also the policies changed pretty dramatically into, we all know this is the first country to try neoliberal policies such as privatization, vouchers for schools, and so on and so forth. And I think And this comes back to the current situation. The 1980 constitution that he passed, it's crucial to establish veto points that prevent future redistribution in any way that it's understood, even in regulatory ways. And that has generated a lot of discontent because a lot of it was created to defend a lot of these neoliberal policies like the privatization of pension and so on and so forth. But it has also served to generate the idea that democracy could not produce the changes demanded by the population. The other aspect, of course, is the repression, which not only include thousands of deaths in Chile, but also the murder of Letelier and Moffitt in Washington, D.C. in 1976, by the DINA, the murder of General Prats and his wife in Buenos Aires in 1974, and coordination with other military regimes for that repression in what was the Operation Condor that included 8 countries in the region. I want to show this a lot to show that basically, yes, I mean, it didn't do us, I mean, the economy was doing relatively well, but not all the time. In particular, Chile was the country most affected by the 1980s debt crisis, but also how after democratic transition in the 1990s is when we see, of course, in the 2000s, like in the rest of the region, but when we see a kind of more sustained growth that has made Chile move, I guess, from middle-income country into a basically rich country. So I think it's important to understand that it was kind of coming back to the tradition, the institutional tradition that Chile had before the coup. The whole region moved towards democracy since 1978, with the first transitions in Peru and Ecuador. The debt crisis of the 1980s fostered very bad economic crisis, and as a result, this affected the legitimacy of military regimes, and that moved most of the countries of the region towards democracy. Colombia, Venezuela, and Costa Rica were already democratic. But one of the, and Chile was the exception in the 80s. There was an effort of democratization that failed because due to Chile's economic recovery. But one of the things that's interesting is that this first wave of transitions following what O'Donnell and Schmitter's book on transitions called the king and the queen, the king being the defense of property rights and the queen, the respect of the military or the amnesty for the military, was very strong in most of the cases. I think Argentina was a little bit of an exception because of the defeat in a war, but in most cases, these transitions were transitions negotiated that led to moderate regimes. As I said before, in Chile it failed, and so in Chile the transition really happened because the 1980 constitution had a plebiscite in 1988 for the continuation of Pinochet. Pinochet called for the plebiscite, assuming he would win it. Over the campaign, it was clear that he was not going to win it. I really recommend the movie No for those who want to see the campaign. And what is important here is the change in U.S. policies, because the Reagan administration pressed Pinochet to accept the result, and so did the junta. He was not willing to accept the result, but the junta went in public to say that he had been defeated, and the U.S. was paying attention and pressing him to accept the result. So I think it's important to understand that there is a shift in U.S. policies, even within Republican administrations. And so what happens after the end of the Cold War? I mean, one of the things that happens is at the beginning, when it allows democratization in the backyard in Mexico and Central America, There is a movement in the 90s towards free trade agreements as a way of dealing with the region rather than intervention. We have the NAFTA, we have the CAFTA. But when Bush had an effort of a regional trade agreement that fails, and that's also the time when Chavez and the alternative, the kind of left-wing radical left emerge, there is kind of a decline of interest in the region. And that decline of interest in the region also reduced the influence of the United States. Even when the U.S. has now more pro-democratic policies, it's much less what they can do. We saw it with the autogolpe, with Fujimori in Peru. We saw it with Venezuela, with Nicaragua, more recently with El Salvador and Guatemala. There's little policy tools. The toolkit of the United States has been reduced, in part because it's not paying attention to the region. The sanctions, that is what the US is doing, are not working. Intervention is not possible in the current international regime. And so the US has basically reduced its attention to the region, except for issues of migration and drugs. That has been the main attention, and in particular migration, because it affects domestic politics of the US. So what happened when the US stopped paying attention to the region? Well, we have the fact that China occupied a lot of the space left by the US. South America was a main trading partner of China, and it's second for all of Latin America, because in Central America and Mexico, there's more trade with the US. And there is increasing foreign investment. It's now 9% of the region from China, and especially in infrastructure and energy. There's also much more lending from China to countries in the region, and most countries in the region participate in the Belt and Road Initiative. We see it even in the Central American countries like Honduras that have just cut relationship with Taiwan and recognized China. We see that all over the region, even in countries that were traditionally part of the backyard of the United States. What are the challenges of the US for the region? There is a security challenge. The US drug market, the US weapons, and I think the policies of the war on drugs that decapitated monopolies and spread the number of players in the criminal world and their competition in the region has fostered a security crisis in the region. I don't think the US is conscious to the extent to which this would spread into the southern part of the United States. The Cold War legacies of lack of democracy, restrictions to redistribution, have contributed to the discontent of citizens in institutions and to instability. As I gave before the example with the 1980 Constitution in the case of Chile, I think it's not a solution to change the Constitution, but certainly it was a bracket to reforms that could have made the democracy more legitimate. And there's also the issue of climate, where the US has a strong interest now for energy transition, and the region is a crucial player. And here again, I see resistance in the region. We saw the meeting of Amazonian countries recently, a month or so ago, and there is the perception that, again, the US is asking for a lot, but not giving much in exchange. So it's harder for the US to have influence in the region. It seems that its impact on the region was the withdrawal of the support for policies that restricted democracy. but there's also an issue of credibility due to the legacy of interventions, and that has been used to justify democratic backsliding. We saw it in Cuba. I don't think the Castros could have lasted for so long without claiming that the U.S. is trying to depose them. We saw it in Venezuela. The U.S. recognized the government that emerged of the coup in 2002, and that justified Chavez in democratic backsliding. I think there is really even reduced influence among economic elites, much more looking at China now than ever before. And the question I have is, to what extent migration and domestic U.S. policies are going to produce a new Cold War look into the region going on? And I don't have an answer for that. Thank you. Let me stop sharing.
Great, thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. If you have any questions, please go ahead and share them in the Q&A function. It's the easiest way for us to go through them here. So there are a few questions here that have already come in. My name is Miyako Yerrick, and I am the admin for the ColumbiaDC Alumni Club. So you have a lot of things that are already starting a lot of questions, but I kind of want to do a couple of scene setters. So the Chicago Boys are kind of a known economic idea where there were students who went to the U.S., they studied. Oh, I'm muted. Am I muted?
I couldn't listen to you, so can you repeat the question?
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So the Chicago Boys were students that traveled to the United States. They learned about kind of free market principles, and then they brought those ideas back to Chile in the 70s. And we saw, good economic growth. You showed some of the charts of good growth, but now we're seeing kind of pushback on that theory of economic free market reform. So do you think that kind of those policies might have given some growth, but that it's now stalling and really showing kind of some of the inequalities that emerged in Chile as a result of some of those policies that were learned in the U.S.?
So I have to say that there are different things you can learn in the U.S. I mean, there's not a single set of policies. And in fact, at the first, Ricardo French Davis, who was I think the central banker of Patricio Albi in the first administration, also studied in Chicago, and he had very different economic policies. So I wouldn't say there is a single set of policies. But it's true that these particular policies were attractive to Pinochet because they promised to end any possibility of socialists coming back to Chile, which is what he was concerned about. Economic growth was uneven. So at the beginning, there is growth. Then Chile is the country that falls the most with the debt crisis. 25% of GDP falls in 1983, the country most affected by the debt crisis. In fact, I have to say, Pinochet put some of these same people that were now in banks in prison, and he takes over the private debt. So the states nationalize the private debt and has to take over that debt. And then, as I show in the graph, I think the period of highest growth is after democratic transition. I mean, he fares better in coming back from the crisis of the debt crisis in the 80s, in part because the rest of the countries are a little bit of a disaster with hyperinflation, like Peru and Argentina. But it's not a superb economic record. I think the economic record of the Chilean governments after transition is much better.
And then looking at, you mentioned China. So if we look at kind of the current situation, I believe after the Great Recession, China actually invested a lot in Latin America, which helped reduce some of the recessions that countries faced. And you mentioned U.S. influence is going down, but the U.S. is still asking a lot from Latin America. especially as they look for that green energy transition. Chile having a lot of lithium, really important for a lot of green technology, electric vehicles, all of that. So do you see China coming in and potentially having more influence and effect in some of the direction politically, whereas you mentioned back in the 70s, the USSR didn't really have that influence in Chile in the early stages, the development of the Socialist Communist Party. So what influence does China have now, given kind of the decline of the US and in this transition where minerals and green energy are so important, with Latin America being key?
Yeah, so China started entering the region before the Great Recession, actually, in the early 2000s. And the Great Recession was not so strong in Latin America because of the boom of those years. What's important here is that China, a lot of Chinese investments, I mean, I didn't want to show the graph, are on energy and infrastructure. And they are really crucial investors in like renewables. For instance, solar energy, they're a crucial player. They also have bought, so all of the transmission company in Chile has, was privatized. So then the private company sold it to China. And in that case, what I see that's impressive, in countries that are extremely polarized, there is an agreement in South America that China is important for the country. It's like the main trading partner. So Brazilian agribusiness, they might support Bolsonaro, but they didn't want to break with China because that's their market. And so the influence of China in economic terms is enormous at this point. It's like the US before the Cold War. And I think in that sense, the leeway of the US to ask for things without giving anything in exchange has come down dramatically. And that's something that you hear leads both on the left and the right complaining. So I think that goes beyond ideology. Different is the direct lending from China. I think that's much more related to the ideology of the government.
And is the lending from China so important that you think some of the conditions that come with that lending are things that they can accept because they are such a willing partner to engage economically?
So the interesting thing is the lending comes without conditions. China does not establish conditionality in the lending. Instead of that, they want in-kind collateral. So oil, you pay with oil. You do whatever. If you want to build a soccer field with the money, that's your problem. We are not deciding what you do with the money as long as you pay. But it not always works. Like in the case of Venezuela, even though they're supposed to pay in oil because oil is coming down, it hasn't been a great investment to China.
Yeah. Okay, well, we have a lot of questions already coming in, so I'm going to try and get to as many as we can. So we had a question early on, and you mentioned that the Republican administrations in the US even had different policies towards Chile, but historically, was there a difference between Democrats and Republican administrations and how they operated in Latin America between the 1950s and the 1970s?
I mean, there is a little bit of a difference in the sense that Kennedy had this idea of the Alliance for Progress, where Eisenhower supported the coup and Nixon supported the coup. So there are kind of different interpretations of how to deal with the Cold War threat. I'm not sure that Kennedy would have supported a coup against an elected president. Maybe he would have, but we don't know, right? We don't know. I mean, ultimately, a lot of these policies were driven by what was perceived as national security more than anything else. And the perception that this was a terrain of the war between the US and the Soviet Union, and this was the area of influence of this US, I think really was crucial. And so the State Department policies were not so dramatically differences, although there were some. So like Jimmy Carter tried to push more for human rights, but there's limited difference, limited effect on these policies.
I think I remember that generally speaking, historically, foreign policy tended to be fairly consistent, while domestic policy would change dramatically between Democrats and Republicans, but it was at least consistent. I don't know if that's still true, but historically, I think that was.
I don't think that is still true.
Okay.
I think that's a change.
So we have some questions on different Latin American countries, but one question is, will Argentina follow the populist call for closing of the nation's central bank there, and what would the impact be?
So there's two questions there: whether Argentina will elect a populist right-wing candidate, and whether he will be able to close the central bank. So I think he's likely to win the election, and I'll be happy to discuss why. It's less clear to me what he will do if elected, and whether he had the ability to do everything he has promised to do, given the issues of governability that might be involved.
Okay, now we have a question on Mexico. How would you describe the current relationship between the U.S. and Mexico, and what do you think could be done to improve it? How does their relationship impact the rest of the region, especially you mentioned migration being a potential new Cold War? A lot of countries obviously migrating through Mexico. They have presidential elections next year, so a lot going on there with their relationship with the region, and then with the U.S., with, I guess, both of us having elections for president coming up next year.
Yes, well, there's a lot there because there's immigration, the elections.
I just asked 10 questions in one.
Like a very big question. So let me talk about migration and start with like some point of information. So Mexico has a very large number of remittances coming from the U.S. It's an important part of its economy. Now, the district, the municipality that receive the most remittances are in the border with the U.S. and in the border with Guatemala. Mm-hmm. So those remittances are paid by families whose migrant relatives are basically being kidnapped by criminal gangs in both points. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we're not conscious is that the migration regulations that the U.S. has imposed on Mexico, and Mexico is basically stopping people on the southern border so that they don't get to the United States. It's kind of playing the U.S. role there. Have a consequence in terms of building up more of the security crisis, giving more money to criminal groups that are really affecting the region and driving people to leave the region, so making the migration crisis even worse. I think the U.S. has, especially under Trump, but even now, basically delegated its migration policies to Mexico, and Mexico does it as long as it's not bothered with anything else. The treatment to migrants in Mexico is pretty bad. There's been a lot of reports now, and there's not a lot of talking about it in Mexico. It's interesting, they criticize how the U.S. treat Mexicans, but they don't look at also what's happening in Mexico. What will happen with the next election? So Mexico has elections in June of next year. For the first time, the two main candidates will be women, so the next president will be a woman. Most likely, it will be the candidate of Morena. I think the president, López Obrador, is incredibly popular, and his candidate is likely to win, in which would be a continuation of the current policies. I don't think there will be a significant change. And what will happen with the U.S. will depend a lot on who is the president, right? I think some policies like the migration policy, I don't foresee a change. I think that has happened across both administrations. So if we had the Republicans coming back, it will not change. There has been some effort of this administration to try to promote growth in Central America to reduce migration, but that effort has not been really strong or included enough funds to be real. And part of it is that, the governments in the region are, going into less democratic fashion and have nothing that the U.S. has very little to influence them, and they have a very strong weapon to influence the U.S., which is that they can send migrants. Even Cuba is doing that as a strategy. So I think the relationship with Mexico, I don't foresee dramatic changes even with the elections in those countries. The only change I do foresee, I have to say, is the Mexican Supreme Court legalized abortion at the national level. It was legal in many states yesterday. So there might be some migration from Texas or southern states to abort in Mexico.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I hadn't followed that. It's a new migration pattern, maybe.
No, not migration, but movement, I think.
Movement, yeah. Okay, so we have a question on how is the current public view of the U.S.'s role, especially in the 60s and 70s in Latin America? So how do people in Latin America view the U.S. in the 60s and 70s? And does it change based on their socioeconomic class?
I have to say that most people, so 60s and 70s, people to remember that are on the older side. I mean, I taught my Latin American politics class today to 90 students, and nobody had heard of the Cuban Revolution. I mean, well, there was one Cuban student who heard, but the rest are really, Latin America is a young region. There's like the majority of the population, with the exception of some countries, especially in the southern cone, tend to be young. And so they don't care about what happened in the US in the 60s and 80s. I think that's more for like the educated, politicized bunch. For the young, which were the majority, the US is US culture. The US is what they see on their phones, the music, the rap, the whatever. That's the US they know. They know the dollar, but I don't think they pay so much attention to the politics of the 60s and 70s anymore.
Okay. Has the role of military in politics weakened compared to 50 years ago, compared to Perón or Pinochet or even Noriega? And if yes, why?
So that's an excellent question, and I think it's in transition. So if you asked this question 20 years ago, the answer was clearly yes. The military had like very little influence and not much prestige in the countries where they had military regimes, like Peru or Chile or Argentina or Uruguay or Brazil. But that has changed recently. And because there's so many crises of corruption and discontent with political parties, if you look at public opinion, the opinion on the military is improving in relative terms. So I think that's something that is shifting in some countries more than in others. Of course, I mean, Argentina is probably a kind of the most dramatic example, because the military not only destroyed the economy and repressed the population, but they lost a war, and in a very bad way at the expenses of many draftees that were badly treated. So that had a very strong toll on the military. But I think in many other countries, you see an improvement of the view of the military, and also an incredibly increased influence of the military, because they're used in the security crisis. So Mexico, it's a clear example, with the military are much more influential now than they've ever been. And I think in a sense, they call the government, they have a lot of power over the government. We see it now with the cases of the disappearance, the Ayotzinapa case, that the government might not want to do what it's doing, but they certainly cannot prosecute the military given the cost that they would have for stability.
And at least in Mexico, I know the military is gaining a lot of responsibilities, where AMLO keeps giving them more and more things, where they don't even necessarily have the expertise to do those tasks. So it might turn around on them, but for now they are being.
Part of it is that the politicians lost prestige and the military still had that prestige. And so, I mean, the same happened in the 1990s when I did my dissertation and I went to Venezuela. I do remember the military had like such a big prestige because they had not intervened in politics, they had not military coup. And if you go now to Venezuela, I'm sure the situation is very different because they are all involved in like corruption scandals and so on and so forth. So I think it's part of the experience that people have with the military. And so I think you're right. Over time in Mexico, their prestige will come down.
Okay, so we still have not managed to get our questions below 10, even though we've been going here for a while. We still have half an hour, so we have some time. But we have a question on Guatemala. I'm scrolling fast, talking fast, scrolling fast. So what do you foresee in Guatemala, and will Arevalo be allowed to take office and govern?
So that's a tough question. He made it there because he was certainly under the radar. He polled so low that they didn't bother to disqualify him like they did with every other candidate with a chance of winning. He won the election. He's facing a lot of obstacles from the Consuelo Porras, the prosecutor, and even his party was lose its personality, how you say that, it's like legal standing, but the Electoral Commission has allowed him to proceed. I think, it's a little bit, that's a good case in which, the interests that are going to be affected and they're afraid of him are trying everything to prevent him from inauguration. The U.S. have had a positive role there. But I think even if he is inaugurated, which I think it's probably the most likely outcome, it would be very hard for him to govern. Like, he would be a minority in Congress. The state is so taken by interest, by corruption, it seems it would be very hard for him to achieve the reforms that he really wants to do. And that's what really makes me fearful, because the people of Guatemala are so hopeful, and they voted with the hopes that all of this is going to change rapidly. We won't have more corruption. We will not have more food. Guatemala is one of the poorest countries in the region, the one with hunger. And I'm not sure he will be able to satisfy those demands, and that could have consequences for governability.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have a few questions on migration, so maybe we can hit some of those. One of them is, how do you see immigration policies changing in Latin America, specifically thinking about Venezuelan and Haitian immigrants moving throughout the continent? And just kind of as some context, I know back when Colombia was having their war, Venezuela took in a lot of people, but then when Venezuela's economy started going down, Colombia was taking in a lot of Venezuelans. So how is that migration shifting, and also with the Haitians?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So Venezuela has more than 10% of its population out. So it's like one of the worst crises of displacement, I think, that we've seen in the region. And Venezuelan migrants are everywhere. Colombia is one of the countries with most migrants, but so is Ecuador and Peru and Chile and to a lesser extent Brazil and Argentina. And the policies at the beginning were quite positive, because the expectation was that the regime would not last for so long, and also that there was an effort to distinguish these crises happened when there was like Lenin Moreno in Ecuador, Duque in Colombia, Macri in Argentina, Piñera in Chile. So kind of more right-wing governments that wanted to show that Maduro, that these left-wing dictatorships look at the poverty they produce and how people are doing, how bad people are doing. So at the beginning, the policies were relatively open to migrants from Venezuela, but then over time, as the economies of these countries start doing worse, and especially during the pandemic, there has been a hardening of migration policies towards Venezuelan people in almost all countries. I have to say Colombia is not the case. That's an exception. Argentina is also an exception, but that's because Argentina is also a country that has been very open to migrants, has a very, very liberal migrant policy, especially for migrants from Latin America. But Chile has seen a harshening, even so certainly the situation is much worse, and that's why we see the efforts to come to the U.S. through the Darien. So what we've seen in the Darien is part of that. The economic conditions are worse. They cannot, do well, send money home. They're not treated well, so they decided to move up. So that's for Venezuelans. Haitians, I think it's not a problem only of legal regulation, but a problem of open discrimination. So the fact that Haitians look different, most Venezuelans more or less, they do not necessarily look the same, but they could pass. They're but Haitians, it's the language, but it's also the race. And so regardless of the policies, I think they are treated very differently. And the reason why I know it's really race is Argentina, as I said before, it's the most liberal country in the region with regard to migration. It's very easy to become a citizen, to get a permit to work and so forth. And there's street vendors everywhere. The way, I just talked to a demographer working on this. There's a Senegalese migration, and the way the police treats these people is completely different from how they treat any other migrant. And so here, the idea is if you are, of Asian origin, if you are of indigenous origin, if you're white, all of that's okay. But if you're Black, it's a little bit more complicated.
And then looking at how migration to the U.S. is viewed in Latin America, both from the people who live in Latin America as well as the government. So do they have different views of migration to the U.S.? Does the government think it's okay? Or do the people think is there kind of a difference there?
Yeah, I think for the governments, at least the countries with lots of migrants, because Chile or Uruguay or Brazil doesn't have a lot of, they have migrants, but it's not significant for the economy. But Nicaragua, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, Mexico, the remittances are significant for their economy. So for those countries, it's like another industry, right? They're economically dependent on those migrants. And as I said before, I think that there is also a political use of migration. Cuba can do this, when you start seeing lots of migrants coming historically in Cuba, that has forced the U.S. to sit at the table. It happened in 1978 with the Marielitos, right? And I'm not sure to what extent, other countries might also follow that route to okay, if you want us to stop migration, what are you giving us?
Mm-hmm. Although Mexico is, like you mentioned, really kind of stopping a lot of the migrants at the border and the remain in Mexico policy. So it is different now, where they're not all making it all the way up to kind of the southwest border, or the whole south border, I guess. All right, one more migration question here. Do you think a stricter border policy from the Biden administration would cause tensions in Latin America? And is that why it has not been adopted?
I think the border policy is quite strict at this time, but the tensions in Latin America are not caused by the border policy. I think there are other policies of the United States that cause the tensions, the access to weapons that, are bought on the Mexican border, where lots of gun shops are sales to Latin America. I think that's much worse in terms of creating the conditions that cause migration than whatever migration policy the U.S. would have.
Okay, we have a question from Alexander, who says, what is the current level of resource nationalism in the region, and how hostile is it to foreign corporations?
I think that varies per country. I don't think there is a single answer to that. And I think a lot of the resources require for capital, and that's not necessarily in the region. And all the countries in the region have foreign investment, whether it is from China, the U.S., or the Arab countries. But I see that what you see in terms of nationalism is the desire to have access to the rules, like we see it on lithium, in particular in the case of Bolivia and Chile, and there's no law in the case of Argentina. That's the lithium triangle. But here is more a question of how it's happening. There are a lot of costs for the environment and for local populations. So I think that the type of resource nationalism in the case of Chile, I don't think that's true of the case of Bolivia, is not just driven for getting all the rents, but also for how the process of extracting the lithium happens. In the case of Bolivia, I think it's more driven both by increasing the rents and by forcing investments that process the lithium. But you see that emerging in the case of lithium, but in the other resources, I don't see any strong reemergence of nationalism.
Okay, so going back to some of the earlier questions, specifically on Chile, somebody says, Jared Diamond in one of his books reviewed the Chile coup and claimed that part of the problem was the socialists trying to push changes beyond their political capital, considering they didn't win an overwhelming majority. He also points to the free election that happened about a decade after, in which people voted for the Chilean conservatives. Can you evaluate that perspective?
So, yes, sure. I don't disagree that he was a minority president and his policies might not be the best, but you could wait to the next election and defeat him. I mean, I don't think a military coup is explained by bad policies. I mean, all governments have bad policies in the region. The incumbents are not being reelected overwhelmingly now because the policies are not good or people don't like the policies. And so that's the solution. I don't think a military coup is the solution to, oh, I don't like their policies, therefore I call the military, bomb the presidential palace. I mean, that's not how democracy works. I don't know exactly what are the elections that he refers. A decade later, the only election that there was the election on the Constitution, which was a plebiscite. And there's a lot of evidence that there was fraud, and you could only vote in favor or against the plebiscite. There was a lot of not just fraud, but managing of who could vote. There's not another election until the plebiscite of '88, and that's also not like an election with conservatives. So the first time there is a real election is the 1989 election, and that's won by the Concertación, so not by the right. So I'm not sure what he's referring to. I mean, the first time the right wins an election, it's not until this century, with Sebastián Piñera. So I'm not sure what he's talking about.
Okay, well, if that person is listening, maybe they can give us some more context, but we will move on. Philip has a question, says, how much did the transition government's better economic results relate to the upswing in the commodity cycle through the aughts, so the early 2000s, particularly given Chile's role as the world's largest copper supplier?
Certainly that helped during the 2000s, but growth is sustained during the 1990s. So from 1990, so since Allende is inaugurated on March of 1990 until 2003, and Chile sustains there is a 5-year recession that affects the whole region with the Brazilian and the Russian crisis. So from 98 to 2003, it's a deep crisis in many countries of the region, and Chile is the one who works the best in applying counter-cyclical policies and fares much better even before the commodity boom. It's only, well, since 2009 that has changed, but it was a sustained growth during the transition period before the commodity boom for a decade.
Okay, remembering the brazen assassination of Orlando Letelier here in DC in 1976, is it correct to assume that the influence of Latin American countries in the US has also weakened?
I don't understand the question.
Well, I will try and reframe here. So I guess you had mentioned that US influence in Latin America has declined. I guess this person is assuming that Latin American countries also had some influence with the US. So has that influence declined from whatever level it might have been back in the 70s?
I don't think Latin American countries had a lot of influence. I mean, the fact that Pinochet could send someone to kill Letelier in DC, I guess that's influence in that the CIA should have known. But like, 9/11 happened in New York, and would you call it that's influence of Afghanistan, the Taliban? I mean, it's a terrorist attack. I don't know if to call that influence. I don't know. Maybe the CIA knew. I don't know. I mean, it's true that the CIA and the DINA had closer relations, but I imagine the CIA did not know. They would have known. I don't know. The rest of the countries in the region had a close relationship, especially on military assistance. With the School of the Americas, the Argentinians work with the Contra in Central America. And I think there might have been some degree of influence from these collaborations in the sense that when the 1982 Malvinas Falkland War happened, General Alexander Haig, who was the Secretary of State, proposed, I do remember studying, proposed a solution which was an umbrella to discuss, sovereignty between Britain and Argentina, which Argentina stupidly didn't accept it, but thanks God, because that got us rid of the military. When Britain was the closest ally to the United States, and Argentina had invaded the island. So that was incredibly benign from the United States in geopolitical terms. So I have to say that there must have been some influence, at least on military terms. But that's the only evidence, much more than the Letelier assassination that I can see.
Okay, we had a new question come in. Are there governments in the region today that are widely seen by other governments in the region as models for success?
Yeah, unfortunately, yes. I think the one that's becoming very popular as a model of success is Bukele's government in El Salvador. He seemed to have been able, at least, in the last few months, or maybe even a year, I don't remember when did he started this strategy, I think less than a year, to basically control the gangs and the criminal organizations and allow the people of El Salvador to be able to walk back in the streets without fear. That has made him incredibly popular. He's the most popular president in the region. Because crime and security is a big issue, it's one of the main concerns, along with weak economic growth or the lack of economic opportunity in the region, is that there are other governments of the region trying to imitate him. The most clear example is Xiomara Castro in Honduras, although without success. But certainly he is a name that's coming in elections in other countries as a model.
Okay, this is a very interesting question that I hadn't thought of before. Somebody says, Peru has had a leader of East Asian ancestry, and Argentina, Ecuador, and El Salvador have had leaders of Middle Eastern ancestry. Does this tell us anything about attitudes to ethnic minorities in Latin America?
Certainly more, it tells you more about the U.S. You know, I mean, certainly Peru had a Japanese president. He seems that he actually was born in Japan. Argentina had a Muslim president. He converted to Catholicism to become president because the constitution at the time required that, and he changed the constitution on that requirement being president. But he was married to a Muslim woman, had Muslim children. The child died when he was in president. He was buried in a Muslim cemetery, and he died recently, and he was buried in a Muslim cemetery. So the conversion was really a political need. I don't think anybody cared. That's it's not an issue. It wasn't an issue in El Salvador. It wasn't an issue in Argentina. Whether he was like, people care. I mean, he's loved and hated, but not for that reason. That was never an issue in the campaign. In the current Mexican election, I'm surprised the candidate of Morena is not just a woman, she's Jewish. That doesn't seem to be an issue in the campaign. I think it's different in Latin America, the extent to which ethnicity and religion play a role in politics. It's only the evangelicals that are really making an issue of religion. And in that case, it's not ethnicity, it's religion that's becoming important.
Okay, one of our early questions is from Rob, and he says, all things being equal, which they never are, wouldn't you say that the U.S. would prefer to support democracies, including in Latin America? However, to whatever extent the U.S. has or has not supported democracies, wasn't the overwhelming driver of U.S. foreign policy in the region to support anti-communist regimes or governments, regardless of whether they were democratic or autocratic, at least through the fall of the USSR, and against anti-socialist governments since the fall of the USSR?
During the Cold War, that's what we said at the beginning. I think that was a very sustained policy of the State Department. That was the Cold War, reduce the influence of the Soviet Union or anything to smell of influence of the Soviet Union. I think in the documents that have been declassified in Chile, the conversations between Nixon and Kissinger are pretty clear, and the need to prevent the inauguration of Allende, because if we allow an elected, left-wing leader to be elected in Chile, it could happen in Italy. So certainly it was part of a global geopolitical game. After the end of the Cold War, I am more hesitant. I don't think the US has the same incentives. It seems to me that the US is more driven by its own domestic interests. So migration is an important part of what's driving US policy towards the region, and the drag on wars before was an important part. In the case when Florida was competitive, Cuba was important. So we used to say the US only care about Cuba, the Dominican, Cuba, drugs and migration. Cuba, not so much anymore now that Florida seems to have been painted on a single color. And so I don't think the US cares so much about the ideology of the presidents anymore.
And then speaking of the Cold War, you had said earlier in your presentation that migration could be the new Cold War. Can you say a little bit more about that idea?
Yeah, so I mean, it comes back like, the policy towards the region for a while was driven by US geopolitical interests with the Soviet Union. And now the only interest is mainly the domestic effect of migration. But if the US doesn't pay attention to the region, the politics of the region, the increases in crime, the fact that the economy is not doing well, the increased dissatisfaction with politicians, and all of that, it's just creating more migration. You can try to stop them at the border. You can get Mexico to stop them at the southern border, but people are still coming. And in fact, not only Latin Americans are coming because of the geography of the continent, people are flying from the Middle East, from Africa, to countries in the region that do not require visas and are crossing through the Darien towards the U.S. So even if like 10% of the people go, are not caught, that's still a lot of people. And the problem for Mexico, of all the migrants that stay in Mexico, it's only going to grow. So I think in a sense, it might become a problem for the US, not just in terms of migration, but in terms of, for instance, the expansion of the security crisis into the US. All of these criminal organizations, which are actually entrepreneurial capitalist organizations working on the illicit economy and on the licit economy as well, on the avocados we here it's very easy for them to establish networks in the United States. And we don't know the extent to which they already have networks in the United States and can affect the security situation of the United States. So again, I think this idea that it's just possible to stop rather than to try to create some cooperative policies that give an incentive for people to stay in the region is very short-sighted, and it might become as short-sighted as some of these Cold War policies that end up being not good for democracy and not good for welfare of the people of Central America. It's a clear case. For instance, under Clinton, he deported all these people who were in US prisons, which feed the Maras in El Salvador, because these were people who did only know what to do, what was with crime. They had ties to the US, access to markets. And so again, the US is kind of short-sighted in thinking about migration. And as it happened in many parts of the world, I mean, I was having a conversation with Camille, like, the 54 coup in Iran, yes, it brought a shock, but then, we had the revolution. So I think the US is being short-sighted in its policies towards the region, especially given that they are on the same continent. So eventually people and other things are traveling back and forth.
When I hear about migration, I hear a lot about push and pull factors. So the US, I feel like you mentioned a lot of the movies, the music, those kind of things will always be a pull as well as job opportunities. But some of the push factors, as I understand in Latin America, at least, is the inequality, not having, economic growth, security issues. But if we see China continue their investment in Latin America and we see some development of those countries, if more countries like Bukele are able to get, more security, people feel safe, do you think that could help migration go down? And what kind of impact might that have in the China-US global competition?
I haven't thought about that, but I guess China, as I said, gives you the money without strings attached if you pay in kind. So oftentimes that results in even higher levels of corruption. That doesn't mean it would produce growth. It certainly would produce infrastructure for you to export to China what China needs, and it could produce energy. But I haven't seen the countries where China has been lending performing better in terms of economic and social indicators. In fact, some of them, such as, Venezuela or Nicaragua, are doing much worse. Even in Ecuador, at the end of the Correa administration, when he started relying heavily on Chinese loans, I don't see those investments having resulted in industries or infrastructure that clearly produce growth for Ecuador. And shortly thereafter, there was a very deep adjustment. And so it's unclear that would happen. It seems to me more than trade flows are helping the growth of illicit economies. Like, Ecuador is a good case with, the turf fight for access to territory by drug cartels. and the exports of drug with bananas, right? So it's not clear to me. And in fact, the Pacific, where there's free trade agreements with the U.S., it's the area where the drug, the criminal organizations are growing the most. You see it in Chile, in Ecuador. It's not just Peru and Colombia anymore.
And so we have a couple of minutes left. I'm hoping you can tell us what you think would be a good solution. Pick Chile if you want, or the region. What can we do to kind of help the economies in Latin America, either us being the U.S. or just kind of the global population?
So I think that the energy transition gives a chance of thinking again about the economies in the region, but maybe trying to avoid the extractive strategies that we had before with oil and with minerals, and trying to think of those in terms in which they are providing a lot to the world with climate. So if we push for an extractive strategy, say, we push for biofuels and that produces the deforestation of the Amazon, that's counterproductive. But if we want people to keep the forest in place, we need to give them incentives and jobs and opportunities, because everybody wants to have a better lives. And I think we don't pay enough attention to the value of the natural resources that are untouched there, and how can we work in a just energy transition, but one also that give them the incentives to avoid destroying what nature is left, which is a global public good.
And last question, we have Columbia alumni here, Harvard alumni, constantly learning. So if you had resources to recommend, where can they continue to go and learn about these topics, be it podcasts, books, articles, authors, kind of where can they go to continue to learn more?
Well, there's infinity, like the number of resources is enormous. I do recommend the Pinochet file by Peter Kornbluth for the case of the coup, especially now that we have 50 years of the coup. I have written an edited volume recently on institutional weakness in the region that covered many different areas, and I think it's a good entry point to some of the problems in the region. And then, you guys have asked me about such an array of different questions that it seems hard to think of a single or a couple of books that deal with them. But if you guys send me the topics, I'll be happy to send suggestions.
Great. And in the last couple of minutes, any closing thoughts from you?
It's been a pleasure to be here, and especially to a collaboration between Harvard and Columbia. I came to the U.S. to do my PhD at Harvard. I learned a lot about Latin America there. And I teach, in fact, I taught today my Latin American politics class at Columbia. So I think it's kind of the full circle. I am very grateful to both institutions. I learn a lot in both institutions, and I think there's tons of excellent colleagues in both institutions to learn from. I invite you to go into the Institute of Latin American's website. We have, you can register yourself and you'll get the information of our activities. Many of them are online. So like we will have one online on the Argentine election, for instance, coming up. And it'd be delightful if you guys can join us. And also it would give you a view of other colleagues that are doing extremely interesting work on Mexico in particular. We have a Center for the Study of Mexico and Central America. We have a Lehman Center for Brazilian Studies. And so I invite you to follow us in social media and to also check our website. I have a podcast there, so if you're interested in hearing my podcast, that's also another option.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. I know we had a ton of engagement from our audience. We did record this session and we will share the recording tomorrow via email. And I think that's it from us. Thank you again so much. I really enjoyed speaking with you, and everyone have a great night.
Thank you. Goodbye.